How are you all today?
Good.
Excellent.
Thank you, Tom. Yourself?
Doing well, thanks. Looking forward to another great Born session. And I'm turning it over to the three commenters moderators. All yours.
Okay, thank you, Dan. So today, Wendy, Mario, and I are going to moderate today's presentation. So before inviting the speakers today, we have only two speakers today. Before inviting them, we are going to take time to briefly present the studies that were presented last week. So I'm going to start with Anna's presentation that was done last week. Okay, so Anna presented on beyond the holarctic comfort zone, thermoregulation of Sunderland rodents. So she basically tried to compare the thermoregulations of tropical and non-tropical or temperate mammals with a specific aim to understand the upper and lower limits of their thermoneutral zones. The fluctuations in the resting body temperature of tropical mammals compared to temperate mammals, and the flexibility of tropical mammals at high temperature than temperate mammals. And before addressing these objectives, she gave a clear overview of thermoregulations and ectothermy versus ectothermy versus endothermy, and she also highlighted the thermoneutral zones for homeothermic and heterothermic mammals to answer her research questions. So for the method, she used trapping and measurement of weight, body temperature, and respirometry of the rodent that she was studying about. And she found both the upper and lower limit of the thermoneutral zones of the tropical rodents that she was studying. And she found that the lower limit of the thermoneutral zone of the tropical rodents was at about 31 degrees Celsius, while the upper limit was at about 35 degrees Celsius. Also, she found the ratio of evaporation heat loss, metabolic heat production, evaporative water loss, and also thermoconductance of these species. And she concluded that the rodent that she studied fall closer to the homeothermic end of the heterothermic homothermic continuum. And she and her team also established the lower critical limits of the thermoneutral zone, but using the metabolic rate alone, establishing the upper critical limit of the thermoneutral zone in the endothermic mammals may not be a reliable method. So this was her conclusion. That's all. Now I want to pass to Mario.
I think to me.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Yeah, Wendy.
I'm good. Last time we also heard from Abby Mann, who is a student of anthropology at the Department of Anthropology with Bonnie Newsom. And she looks at dog remains at the archaeological site at Holmes Point West near Machias. And she's trying to figure out what kind of insight can these dog remains give us into the human-canine relationship from the past. So she was analyzing stable isotopes from the bone collagen and trying to understand what kind of diet those dogs used to eat. And what they found that over time, the isotopic signature shifted from marine-dominated diet to terrestrial diet, which can then provide us with some further insight into resource availability and potentially also human practices. I decided to be brief, so I'm done. So it's to you, Mario.
Okay, I try to be fast as well. So last week, third speaker was Alessandro Marghetti from Jacqueline Gill Paleoecology Lab. And he presented an overview of the fieldwork in Siberia, where he went last year to explore past and present Beringia to understand the mammal steppe. So Alessandro's fieldwork started in Yakutia, in Yakutsk, place which is a central hub for all places and megafauna findings that happened in Siberia, and all are stored there, so that allow to collect samples from places and mammals. And also in the field, they collected reference material from the recent steppe vegetation. Second visited place was Belaya Gora, which is a place far northeastern Siberia, and it is a well-known place with lots of fossil findings, mostly by tusk hunters. And with collaboration with them and local institution, Alessandro's team collected more samples. So this time they focus on coprolites, which is a fossil dung, and also they collected on more fossil animal gut content. Third visited place was Pleistocene Park in Chersky, where they scouted the place for possible modern experiments. Overall goal of his expedition was sample collection, finding suitable location for vegetation studies, and build the relationship with local institutions. So finally, they collected 95 samples that safely arrived in Maine, and they stored here, as Alessandro said, in Sawyer. And by analyzing ancient DNA, pollens, and microfossil, Alessandro and team want to reconstruct relationship between animals and plants in the past to understand how herbivores interact with vegetation. And this will help to understand the reason behind the animals' extinction in their disappearing from the environment. So that's summarizing Alessandro's last week talk. And now it's time today's speaker. It's Mark.
Just before you go on, I wondered if any of the three of you or together were able to draw any lines between the three talks. Was there any common thread in the research? Were there any overlaps? I mean, beyond the obvious one that they all deal with animals. Maybe you can think about that, and if you have some thoughts, we can come back to it after today's presentation, since it's there are only two talks today.
Sure. Okay, so today first speaker is Mark Royer, and Mark will talk about design for loosely coupled scientific applications.
Great, thank you. Let me share my screen. Hopefully you guys can all see that. So thank you. I'm a PhD candidate in computer science in the School of Computing and Information Science here at the University of Maine. My advisor is Cha, Sudarshan Chwathe. Thank you all for letting me present today. I know it's always a little bit unusual when a computer science talk is presented to a group of largely environmental or earth science. So thank you. So I'm going to talk today about a design for loosely coupled scientific applications. And the goal of this talk is to talk about some of the software issues that are common in scientific applications. So some of the issues that commonly arise when developing scientific applications is that you have software that you develop and you want it to run it both remotely on a server or in the cloud, but then you'd like to be able to also run that same software locally, either on a desktop machine or a mobile device. So how can we encourage the reuse of that software and all of its dependencies in both locations? Another problem is that when you're running the scientific application on these client devices, there are a variety of contexts that they can run in, whether they're going to be on the desktop or mobile applications or various operating systems. So one proposed software architecture for helping to reuse the software application code is to use a software domain logic in an embedded virtual machine. Second part is to make use of a REST API that encapsulates that domain logic and presents it to client code. The third part is to, as much as possible, take that core domain logic code and transpile it into code that can be used on the client side. And then the fourth part is that client side, where the front end to the user, make sure that that code is something that's widely available to be used and widely supported. For example, JavaScript, which can be used in a desktop web browser or in a mobile device. So here's a diagram that shows those 4 components. The first one down in the lower left, in my example, we're going to use Java classes run on a virtual machine, and that's run on a server. So that brings us to the second part in the upper left. We use a REST API server that makes use of the Java libraries. The third part is that when the code base, the Java code base is modified, it's automatically transpiled into JavaScript code. And that JavaScript code, which is that third component in the lower left, is used by the fourth component, the application front end. And the application front end interacts with the core logic either through the REST API or it makes use of that automatically transpiled JavaScript code. So if you use this approach for software architecture, it means that you can reuse your code for both the local and the remote environments. And at the end of the talk, we provide an example seed project that shows how this architecture works. So let me talk about the domain-specific logic first. The domain logic for any software project is in charge of how data is created, stored, and manipulated. We can use the core logic code on different environments in 2 different ways. One is we can encapsulate it using a virtual machine. Some example languages that do this are Java, Kawa Scheme, Kotlin, and Scala. All those languages run on an actual Java virtual machine. And then C# is another example language that runs on its own virtual machine. But the important thing is that these languages are compiled into an executable bytecode, and they're run on the virtual machine. That's what allows them to be run. The idea was, when they were originally created, was you write once, you can run anywhere, as long as you have the virtual machine. The other option is you can use an interpreted language, and that requires an interpreter to be installed. So some common ones are Python and JavaScript. We can also embed a JVM or an interpreter on the environment that we want to run that code. And what that does is it means that the language that you're looking to support would be supported in that environment. And it generally means that you don't have additional software requirements. The software requirements are provided through the virtual machine or the interpreter. REST is the next component I want to talk about. So the REST API server serves out the core logic, and we use representational state transfer. And what that is to most people is you can think of it like a URL. It means that the server it's a stateless. It doesn't have to keep track of a state, basically. But what this is useful for is that it allows you to share code with the client machine and allow the client to make use of the code on the server, so you don't have to have code duplication. And it decouples that logic from the end user interface. You go through the REST API. And it's particularly good for legacy code that has already been written and is still perfectly good and valid, and you want to make use of it in remote client machines, either mobile devices or desktop environments. The REST API allows the client to access data, functions, and additional resources, and it's typically provides those resources either through JavaScript object notation, JSON, or extensible markup language, XML, but there's no restriction on the type of formatting. It's just that the server and the client have to agree on the format to be able to communicate. The third part that I'd like to talk about is the transpiled shared code. So the idea here is that when you take your core domain logic, which in this diagram here is the Java classes, when you make changes to that core logic, eventually the application is going to want to use that logic. And how can we make it so that way the application can use it without breaking? One way is we insulate it using the REST API. But when the data is provided to the application through the REST API, the front-end application still needs to manipulate that data on its end. And so how do you keep that in sync? Well, you can use a transpiler, which is basically a compiler that transforms from one language to another. In this example, we use Java to JavaScript, and then the front-end application can use that JavaScript. So you try to do that as automatically as possible. And there are a number of transpilers out there. These four are all open source transpilers. Google Web Toolkit, it says Google, but it was started by Google, but it's an open source transpiler to JavaScript. G Suite is the one that we use in our example here. Java to Clojure is one that's used, they claim is used inside of Google now for Gmail and a lot of the docs. And Kotlin is another popular one that's being used recently. So for our example project, we use G Suite. Java code is first transpiled into TypeScript, and that's kept in sync in the project. When you compile your Java code, it automatically generates new TypeScript code. And then that TypeScript code is converted into JavaScript and run in the browser on the client on the front end. So the application front end, we want to use a language that's widely supported. We don't know what the application front end could be. It could be a desktop program, or it could be a mobile device. So using something that's widely supported like JavaScript makes a lot of sense. If it's a desktop application, it could be a native application, in which case it would have to run in Mac OS or Windows or Unix, Linux. Or it could be, another option would be a single page application that runs inside of a web browser. And this is the idea similar to Jupyter Notebooks or something like Gmail or Google Docs. Another option is that it runs inside of a mobile application, mobile device. And I just wanted to put up two statistics here. Globally, most people use Android, but in the United States, most people use iPhones, iOS. You can get more flexibility on the front end if you develop a single page application that runs inside of a browser, and then that code can be reused on mobile applications. And then the shared code, in our example, we use G Suite. Java code is converted into TypeScript. That TypeScript is then converted into JavaScript. And then for mobile applications, because Android uses Java, you can just use the same Java code. And for iPhones, there are two projects. One's called NativeScript and one's called React Native. And those actually make use of JavaScript to create native apps for the mobile devices. As I said, there's an example project on this git.icecordedata.org. It's just kind of a proof of concept project to show how it all works. The server code is written in Java. The shared code is transpiled into TypeScript and then into JavaScript. And then the client code, we use a node package management server for. And that's what it looks like. In conclusion, this is just a software technique that facilitates legacy software reuse, interfacing with multiple language dependencies, and it supports separation of concerns. And like I said, if you're interested in the seed project, talk to me, and we're serving at git.icecordedata.org. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna ask for some questions, so go ahead.
This isn't a question. I just wanted to thank Mark and his advisor, Chow. They've been working with us for many years, and so much of what they've done has been particularly valuable because we all have the unique sorts of data sets we work with, and we need people like Mark and Chow to help translate this information, to be able to put it through various statistical tools. So just a very big thank you for everything you've done for us for the last few years.
Thank you.
I guess I will open it to questions if anybody has some.
Can I ask a question? That's Andre.
Sorry, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, Mark. It's Andre.
Hi,
I have a
Andre.
question. Can you please comment who's your user base for this new technology? Is it people like us, or are you thinking more it's like a computer scientist like you?
No, people like you.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so that's exactly the you're exactly the group that this would be focused for. The idea is that you already have so many libraries and tools that you've developed, and well, I've developed some, and other people have developed, and the idea behind designing software this way is to be able to make the previously developed software more widely available in different environments.
No, it's great. I mean, I can see potential value. It's really outstanding. So thank you so much. Yeah, it's very fascinating. Okay.
Does anybody have more questions? I think since we today only have 2 speakers, we probably have a little bit more time for discussion.
Sure, I can ask a question. I was wondering if you, maybe this is outside the scope of your work, but do you have any thoughts on the energy usage, or the energy that goes into different types of coding and different types of computer use, and how that can be made more efficient?
That, I think that's outside of what I do, but
Okay, thanks.
yeah, but something to think about for sure.
Any more questions from the audience? I guess I will ask one more question. Mark, do you work with other people at CCI, or so far with the ICE Core group?
Yeah, so I work mostly with the ICE Core group. We've done projects with other groups, and I should be thanking everybody that I've worked on projects with at CCI. I'm sorry that I didn't list people here, but yeah, mostly the ICE Core group, but other people as well. So.
Wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I don't know if there are any other questions. I guess if not, we can move forward with our second talk today. And it will be Joe Mohan from the Saros Lab. And he's going to define the Anthropocene for us.
All right, let me get this sorted. And the slideshow. Could someone confirm you're seeing the slideshow?
Yeah, it's great.
And the red marker is on this screen? Okay, cool. Great. So this is derived from some of my dissertation research, not directly related to it, but I happened to notice something interesting in the sediment core from Herd Lake that I've been working on, and thought this was kind of a cool idea to perhaps run with and see where it takes me. So just have a big hourglass here to get us thinking about time. And I'm not claiming to have defined the Anthropocene or to be defining it. I'm just claiming to have a sediment core that I think should be considered by the broad scientific community as a possible marker for the Anthropocene. So we're thinking about geologic time here. And so as we move up through geologic time, we get to this funny layer where there's a bunch of humans running around, mucking things up, driving their cars around, and causing a whole lot of change. And the three things I'll take you through here is a brief overview of how we define geologic time. I'll give you an example, one of the more famous examples, the start of the Paleocene or the end of the age of dinosaurs, because I think it's a good quality marker bed to draw comparisons on. And then I'll propose that Herd Lake, Idaho, which is the lake that I do study for my dissertation research, is a quality possible type section. And I'll get into what a type section means. So just thinking about geologic time and how humans may have some impact on that. So to start off, how we actually define geologic time, we have a whole bunch of global boundary stratotype sections and points, which are, for the most part, quite literally a piece of brass or a golden spike, as the colloquial term is, that are pounded into rock sections. And basically above this line is the Ediacaran, or above that line on other sections would be the Holocene or the Cretaceous, the Jurassic, the Permian. And there's a whole bunch of these pins scattered around the globe that define where one age ends and the other one starts. They always define the lower boundary or the start of an age. So if we're defining the Anthropocene, we are going to look back in time and say, oh, in what year or at what place in some stratigraphy does the human appearance become very obvious or easy to find. And that point of easy to find is probably more important than the obvious point. If you scroll through a list of these global strato points, or GSSPs, or golden spikes on Wikipedia, you see that for the most part, they're defined by biological events. And then occasionally there's a big climatic event or a magnetic event where poles flip north and south pole. But for the most part, they are defined by biological events, the first appearance of some specific species, or perhaps the last appearance of a specific species. Just a prelude to that example, this one here is defined by an iridium enrichment layer, and that's associated with a meteorite impact that is largely held in view to have been responsible for the downfall of the dinosaurs. So we define geologic time this way, but specifically, who decides this? You know, who gets to say yes or no, or should we or shouldn't we? And so specifically, there is the International Commission on Stratigraphy, a whole bunch of stratigraphers, geologists who look into these matters. And there's a subcommission on quaternary stratigraphy, and then they formed the Anthropocene Working Group. So the three goals of the Anthropocene Working Group is decide if the Anthropocene should be a formal geologic unit. You know, you have to step back and say, are humans actually causing this much change to the geologic record? And if so, should we decide a formal definition? If it turns out that they vote and say, yes, we should define it, then the question becomes, when should its beginning be defined? Because we always define the start of an age. And then it comes down, if it passes those two questions, to actually go out in the field, ask a whole bunch of quaternary stratigraphers and scientists to actually go and find a specific spot out there and put one of those magic or golden spikes in the earth somewhere. So the state of that, should the Anthropocene be defined? This was a big question when I was going through my bachelor's. We would have like debates in it for classes, and it largely came down to some major events. And the one that stands out in my mind, somebody started digging up and paying attention to say that there's a whole bunch of new minerals that have formed from, you know, wastewater contamination or chemical spills, and that kind of really got the attention of the geologic field to say, oh yeah, humans have literally made new minerals that didn't exist before. Maybe we're having a huge impact. So it actually took until 2019 for the Anthropocene Working Group to make a binding vote on the question, should the Anthropocene be defined? And they voted 88% in favor. Yes, we should define the Anthropocene. There were 4 votes against. So basically what they're saying is that the Anthropocene, which would be maybe defined somewhere along here close to the present, is on par with some of these major geologic events through time. So then the question becomes, when do we define the start? And there were, for a long time, many, and there still are many proposals around defining this exact date. Possible examples were the first appearance of agriculture, that would have been a few thousand years ago. Others included start points that were, you know, colonization of North America, because that really changed a whole lot of things. The invention of the steam engine, the eruption of Mount Tambora, because it's a pretty globally big event in 1815. And what they voted, and I won't get into the exact details of why or what here, but they voted that it should be defined around the mid 20th century. So somewhere around 1945, 1950, our little mushroom is preluding to the idea that this is because nuclear bomb testing is probably going to be the easiest thing to find globally. And that's the important note, is that these defining boundaries, you need to be able to find them kind of everywhere on Earth, so that if I'm walking around in the field looking at dirt on the ground, I can figure out, is this dirt Anthropocene, or is this dirt from the Holocene or older? So with these, the effects of nuclear bomb testing, that should make it fairly easy to go, oh, look, there's nuclear bomb waste material here, which is surprisingly widespread if you know how to look for it. So there are specific guidelines that have been laid out to how you pick a global strato point, golden spike. You need to have an adequate thickness of the sediment, so it can't just be like this little tiny exposure. You need to be able to find a big, thick section of sediment. It needs to be continuously sedimented. So you can't have a section that is laying down sediment for a few years, and then there's a big gap in it, and then you define it, because that gap could cause confusion in other places. The rate of sedimentation needs to be high enough that when we come in here, you know, there's a big obvious slice here. If the rate of sedimentation is too low, then everything kind of gets compacted, and maybe you need a microscope to go out and look for it. So when the rate of sedimentation is high, all of these different layers become thicker and more obvious and easy to define. No post-depositional disturbance. So we don't want sediment that got laid down and then mixed up and then laid down and mixed up, because that will confound your ability to find a layer. So those are kind of the geologic guidelines. The biologic guidelines are abundance of well-preserved fossils. So we like to see many, many fossils, so that For example, we can say beneath this layer, there's dinosaurs. Above it, there's no dinosaurs. And that makes things a little easier. Absence of facies change, which if there was a facies change, you could argue that that transition was probably just like a river wandering into a new place. So you want a continuous facies, or basically that the sediment going from the bottom of the section to the top of the section represents the same ecological or depositional environment. Another point here is that the section be favorable to long-range correlation, basically meaning if I can find it in Maine, then I can find it in Michigan or Texas or South America or Africa. Basically, you want to be able to find this indicator bed or whatever you're defining it by anywhere on Earth, ideally. Other possibilities are radioisotopic dating. So we want to be able to put a date on this. We don't want to say this is the Ediacaran above and below it. We want to be able to say like, this is 3.6 billion years ago. Magnetostratigraphy, that's where the North and South Pole, the magnetism flips. And that's been used to define a fair number of golden spikes. And the last one, chemostratigraphy, this is the example from the dinosaur extinction event where there's a huge layer that has iridium, which is a fairly rare element on Earth until you smash a meteorite into the Earth, and that meteorite has a lot of iridium, and now you can find iridium in those layers around the globe. Here's the example from the dinosaurs. So basically below this time, you have dinosaurs, above it, other creatures. And here's a map kind of pointing out the different locations where this iridium layer has been found globally. So for the dinosaurs, we check off a lot of these boxes. Absence of facies change with an event such as a meteorite impact. A lot of these sections changed their ecology because, you know, basically everything died. There was no magnetostratigraphy flip at that point, but there's a huge chemostratigraphy. So arguably this is one of the best defined golden spikes, and it doesn't check all the boxes, but it checks a lot of them. So I present or suggest that Herd Lake is a good type section, and I'll run through these quick. So you might kind of think to yourself, this lowly little lake, how could it possibly be so good at defining this? So it's right up here in Idaho, and this is a picture of the lake. It's a pretty small lake in a deep valley. So when we take sediment out of a lake, oftentimes you get this mud that's pretty undefined. Sometimes you get these nice layers, and then occasionally you get these little bands like tree rings called varves, and essentially each light dark couple represents 1 year. So this sort of characteristic lake sediment makes it really easy to say this was 1952, this was 1945, and so on. And Herd Lake exhibits varves, or these annual layers like this picture, but its varves are continuous and massive in terms of varve thickness. So each varve is about a centimeter thick usually. And it's been doing this for about 1,300 years. So the lake formed in about the year 300. It went for about 100 years just laying down normal mud, and then got to the point where it started laying down these annual couplets in thick centimeter bands. And it has done so until the present day. In geologic terms, adequate thickness of sediment, it has 11 meters of this banded sediment. It has been continuously sedimenting its rate of sedimentation or the thickness of those varves is kind of off the record or off the scale for varves. Usually they're very thin. These are very thick. Because it's varved, we know there's been no post-depositional disturbance. There are tons of diatom fossils, and the lake is still a lake, so there's no facies change. So now the question becomes, is this favorable for long-range correlation? So over here, we're going back in time through this core, and we can kind of pick out obvious things like 1964 peak bomb testing between the Soviet Union and the United States. That's when they were blowing up the most bombs per year. 1952 was the first hydrogen bomb, and that messed up C-14 in the atmosphere. Or maybe 1945, we could pick a specific time because we know exactly when the first atomic bomb was set off at 5:29 in the morning on July 16th. So back to, is this favorable for long-range correlation? If you'll remember, Herd Lake is tiny. So how do we find it across the globe? So while varves are fairly rare in terms of lakes, we do actually find varve lakes kind of all over the place. So these are, each dot is a known varved lake that has continuous varves for the last 100 years. So pretty good case that you could correlate this fairly globally. There's also marine varves. So out in the open ocean, each point is a known varve. And here's a couple pictures from some of those examples of different types of varves. So I would argue that we can check off the radioisotopic dating, the favorable for long-range correlation. These varve counts have been backed up by radioisotopic dating. And then the question of chemostratigraphy, say like that iridium layer from the end Cretaceous. So there is a large carbon excursion through the core. We have kind of this background carbon, and then at around 52, it takes a wild excursion and then kind of comes back. And then other things to possibly look for in the future are going to be these radioactive isotopes. I don't know how to go look for these, but this is kind of future work that I want to dig through the core and see if some of these or what they've decayed into exist. So possibly chemostratigraphy. The case looks pretty good. So that is my case of considering Herd Lake for a potential golden spike. So I intend to probably write up a paper and submit that to the Anthropocene Working Group and see what they say. Thank you. And I hope you kind of take these 3 points home with you.
Well, thank you, Joe. Any questions from the audience?
Yeah, I have a question. So I was interested in the carbon excursion. So was that a increase in carbon or was it a decrease in carbon? And how did the bomb affect the carbon?
So that was an increase in, or that is a decrease in one type of carbon. And then, so the hydrogen bombs, when they go off, they release large quantities of C-14, I think it is. And then that causes us to no longer be able to use carbon dating after that time because it screws things up.
Thanks.
Oh, it's Andre. Can I ask a question, Joe?
Yeah.
It's an interesting idea. I don't want to discourage you, but I remember from a stratigraphic code that it's not just the timing of the transition. You have to have a stratigraphic deposits that's unique and you can trace it in a large area first. And the second one, the boundary has to be well defined time-wise. So in the case of Anthropocene, you basically have a boundary that will be different in different places around the globe. Or you will have like a bomb test that will be the same boundary, but you don't see any changes in the sediments. How are you going to deal with this? I mean, I'm not against this idea by no means. I just think like you might have to change the stratigraphic code first before you can proceed with this, no?
So you're saying that because there is no change in sedimentation?
Right. That's kind of one of the requirements, because it has to be standalone unit that change at that time where the boundary is.
Yeah, so it's actually the opposite, where you want no facies change, so that there's no change in ecological or depositional.
But let me remind you how geological all the units were defined originally, right? So basically people were looking for transitions because back then they couldn't date anything. So that's how they defined different like Jurassic system, you know, Cretaceous. It was a big transition in the sediments during this transition. And then it was a boundary.
So it wasn't a transition in the sediment. They were looking for transitions in the species or the biology that existed there. So
that's one of the ways, yeah, if you have the biology. But like if you don't have it, you have to deal with something. So additional requirement was the sediment. You have to identify it in a code. I'm pretty sure about this, unless it changed since I was undergraduate and I took this class.
If you're referring to so if you, I don't know when you were an undergrad, but if it was before 1986, then it was Cowie et al. And then they revised the guidelines in 1996 in Rahman et al., who Cowie was part of that revision.
So we don't need to have a sediment, we just need to have a time, right? But how do you deal with it? Time is changing. Because the bump layer basically will be beyond detection limit in like 30, 50 years. You will not be able to measure it because concentrations are too low.
Right, that's why I think these VARV definition is probably better.
Okay.
You could use the bomb thing to right now point out and say this layer, but then later you'll find one of these VARV systems out and just you can count the VARVs back and say, oh, this is 1952 or 1950 or whatever they end up picking as the official start date.
Oh, I see. So that's clever. Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
So quick question, very interesting introduction. What happened 1,300 years ago in Idaho that made the VARVs start to appear?
So that'll be like another chapter, but yeah, great. So the valley that the lake was in used to just be a stream valley. And then there was a large landslide on one end that dammed up the valley. And then it took maybe 75 or 100 years for enough nutrients to get dumped into the lake for diatoms to bloom, basically huge, massive blooms in the spring and summer, which cause those light bands. And then the dark bands are from the winter, fall, where there's lower diatom blooms. So basically it took about 100 years for enough nutrients to saturate the water where diatoms were blooming in enough quantities to deposit like basically a centimeter of dead diatoms per year.
Where did you get the 100-year number from?
You're talking about like the base of the core?
Well, you said it took 100 years for the chemistry to be sufficient for diatoms to form. You were guessing at that, but I mean, is that what it typically takes, or is there something in your record that tells you it was about 100 years?
Yeah, so in the bottom section, the core is not varved. We have led to 10 dates way down at the bottom, and then going back the varv counts. It's roughly between 75 and 100 years, but when we look through the diatom fossils for those first maybe 50 years, there's one diatom species that dominates, and it's an indicator of low nutrients. And
Okay.
then for another 50 years, there's one that indicates high nitrogen. And then once the virus start, this other species, Dependencies niagara, shows up, and that's basically a eutrophic or a hypereutrophic indicator where you have tons of nitrogen, phosphorus, silica, everything a diatom could dream of.
Very interesting. And I assume under some situations, this could happen much, much faster, potentially. If you had sewage being dumped into a lake, is obviously where is happening right now.
Yep. Yeah. So sewage, or for many of the changes that have happened in even remote lakes, way up in the Rockies or something, if it's downwind from an agricultural place, they'll get atmospheric nitrogen, and that will change the diatom composition as well.
Thank you.
Hey, Joe, it's Abby. Can I ask you a quick question?
Hey, yeah, great.
So I just wanted to, this is a great talk, by the way, thank you. I wanted to get your insight. So some folks in my field and other fields have proposed that there are potential signs of the Anthropocene happening earlier by maybe a measure of thousands of years based on, I think it would fit into chemostratigraphy in your framework. So smelting activities, early agricultural activities in the old world. So I wanted to get your input. Do you think that, you know, those have any credibility, or do you think that maybe it's just the most recent, really huge inputs from agriculture and other, you know, atomic testing causing Seuss effect and stuff that has a better chance of defining that boundary?
Yeah, so for a long time, the working group was debating these other signals, you know, smelting, agriculture, and what that kind of boiled down to was one of the guideline points is the ability to correlate a specific time across the globe. So some civilizations or places started smelting at different times than each other. So if you go with smelting, then you end up with, like, you know, you would know what the dates were, but
Well, like,
you know,
yeah,
on
like
this continent,
sure, like Northern Europe or whatnot, but maybe not in other, or like in the Near East, but not necessarily other places, right?
right? So ideally, there's no time lag between the signals. So smelting started here 1,000 years before it started here, then the marker is kind of, you know, fuzzy on that. And with the nuclear bomb testing, that happened like almost instantly and spread globally.
Okay, thank you.
Just to follow up on that, I have a colleague in the UK who's heavily involved in this sort of thing, and I always have the same discussion with him. Because if you take a look at the beginning of methane rise as a consequence of agricultural, particularly rice growing, it's about 7,000 or 9,000 years ago, and you can actually see it in ice cores that go in the Antarctic. But on the other hand, there are things like lead, which, as you say, don't start up at the same time. And I wonder if it isn't that lead and or rice production aren't extremely reasonable ways to define the Anthropocene, because the Anthropocene is supposed to be the time period when humans have some impact. And the fact that this organization has put in this statement that says everything has to happen at the same minute is not necessarily realistic in the environment, number one. And number two, even with the meteorite impact that presumably led to the decline of the dinosaurs, I guarantee that those dinosaurs didn't all die exactly at the same time. It took them a while to die out. So I wonder why, this is not criticism of what you said at all, but I wonder why this organization seems to think that everything happens at exactly the same time. And that's when you define it. The world doesn't necessarily work that way.
Sorry to interrupt. I just I was listening to you talk, and that's the thing that really puzzled me about Anthropocene, and you know, Paul and I and Heather and Andre have worked on this question tangentially by finding when pollution started, you know, detectable pollution, and this has started. We clearly have shown that for the last 2,000 years this has been the case, at least in Europe, that we had pollution, and you could define according to that principle. So why do all these things have to start at the same time in order to have a new epoch is odd. And in fact, I think one of the major criticisms to the Permian extinction theory is that its timing is not consistent with the methane increases that we see in the atmosphere. And that was why they were looking at methanotrophs, methanotrophic bacteria, and converting their diet toward methane-producing bacteria in the ocean as the alternative explanation. It was precisely that more gradual emission that warmed. More gradual emission, more gradual warming that due to emissions, that was the question about the transition in that particular instance. So why should it be all at the same time for an Anthropocene? I don't understand.
So I think if you really dig into like any of these golden spikes, you end up with these same kind of arguments into the minutia of, you know, why is it this instance versus that instance? And it typically boils down to what can we find everywhere on the globe? So most of the time it's some totally arbitrary species that just happens to be globally spread and then goes extinct at some major inflection point. So the Permian one is defined by some little conodont jaw fossil that beneath there you find tons of these jaws, and then above that you don't find any of those jaws. But really the cause of the Permian is, you know, methanogenesis and these other things that probably those processes started well before that actual conodont jaw or that species went extinct. And that's kind of the same argument you end up with trying to define the Anthropocene. And I think the Anthropocene has a unique challenge of being like right now, basically. If we define it as 1950, you know, some people were born before then and some people were born after. So the time scales kind of, I think, make things that don't seem so fuzzy in past golden spikes look really fuzzy, because we can you know, articulate these things right now.
So just as a footnote, this process of dividing time in pieces for historians is called periodization, and it's exactly the same process, except that usually historians do it on smaller scale. So you have the early modern period between 1300 and 1600 or 1800, and then the modern period after the Industrial Revolution, etc. I think most historians are fixed in their ideas of more or less where these things happen, but the very work of historians is to think about how you divide up time based on one or another process. So if you look at exploration, or if you look at science, the development of science, or if you look at medicine, the time could be separated differently. And I think you can do exactly the same thing for geology or ecology or climate, except that for whatever reason, geological time requires these golden spikes, which just, I mean, I would love to put some golden spikes in time for history too. It would be really great. But it's an interesting phenomenon, entirely human, but really interesting.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. This was another great session. I just have a few remarks to end us up. I'll start with Mark Royer. Mark shared his thoughts on loosely coupled scientific applications of software, which sounds a bit like something out of the 60s. He also gave us a sweet example of the potential offspring of such a coupling. I have to say that this reminded me of an old Doonesbury strip in which Mike Doonesbury goes to a computer store, asks for help in naive language, and is directed to the user-friendly liveware. And following on Paul's comment, thank goodness that CCI has liveware like Mark. Thank you. Joe Mohan presented his proposal for Herd Lake, Idaho as the type section for the Anthropocene where the golden spike might be placed. I thought he was appropriately cautious in pushing this idea. He didn't try to buffalo us or railroad us into believing him. Still, he seems to be on track and gathering steam to make his case. And if Joe succeeds in driving home his argument to put the golden spike in that little lake in the Varv where the nuclear bomb testing began, it will be explosive news. Thank you, everybody, and see you in a week.
Thank you.